Erik Davis, who is here from San Francisco, is an author, podcaster, award-winning journalist, and popular speaker based in the Bay Area. He grew up in North County, Southern California, spent a decade on the East Coast, where he studied literature and philosophy at Yale, and spent 6 years as a freelancer in Brooklyn and Manhattan. He's the author of 4 books: Nomad Codes, Adventures in Modern Esoterica, The Visionary State, A Journey Through California's Spiritual Landscape, which is also wonderfully, as the photographs in that book are very stunning. For those of you that know the series 33 and a Third, like small volumes on different records, Erik wrote the best one, of course, on Led Zeppelin 4, one of my all-time favorite records. And his first and best-known book remains Technosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information. And we have that here in the bookstore. Erik also wrote the libretto and performed in How to Survive the Apocalypse, which is a Burning Man-inspired rock opera. You can ask him about that during the Q&A. And for many years, since 2010, he's hosted the podcast Expanding Mind, which has a continually phenomenal array of guests. It's an incredible podcast. Erik also recently, 2015, received his PhD in religious studies from Rice University. And a new book that just came out, went out of print, and is coming back into print within the next few weeks is called High Weirdness: Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s. And that's about Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson. So he's got a ton of material. I'm very, very happy to have him here. And for those of you in the LA area, if you don't get enough this morning, you can go see him at the University of Philosophical Research on Monday night. I will probably be there as well. And one more piece, if I may, Psychedelic Sangha, which is also something that Erik's involved with in San Francisco and travels, and he's done some stuff in LA and I think in Oregon and up and down the coast. So he's involved in the community as well as his own academic research pursuits. It's wonderful to have him here. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Erik Davis.
Thanks, David. And thanks, everyone. It's really wonderful to be back here. It's such a beautiful place, and I'm feeling in the spirit. I'm really sad about Diana. She's a good friend of mine, and in fact, if you're familiar with her book, American Cosmic, some of the characters in there are people that we both met together at the same conference at IONS, and so I was really looking forward to seeing her again. I had her on the podcast about a year ago when the book came out, so I'm sad she's not here, and does mean I have more time, and I have a lot of material, so I don't want to wear you down too much, but I thought of I kind of want to track two interrelated issues. You know, if we think about imagination and technology as being kind of separate, what I'm going to try to show is the imagination that's already in technology, particularly media technology. That's really what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about powerful machines. I'm not talking about life extension. I'm talking about media and the technologies of consciousness and communication. But I'm also interested in the technology that's in imagination. And you might go, what do you mean by that? Well, it's like the media that is in the idea, the history of the imagination. Because the imagination, as I'll talk about briefly here at the beginning, is also a medium. And so some of the issues of mediation that we see with technologies are also bound up with the problem and the question of what is the imagination? How does it work? Does it let us see things beyond the sensory world? And so there's a nice intermingling of these issues. So what I'm going to do is, there's 3 parts. First part of the talk is going to be about a little brief history of the idea of the imagination and the ways in which imagination is woven into questions of mediation, including distortion, illusion, masking, and lies. The second section is really the meat of it. It is a brief history of imaginal machines, and it's talking about how, as media devices, particularly involving light, emerge around the Renaissance and the early modern period, sort of the period when we're shifting into science, shifting away from the old enchanted worldview, how the technologies that begin to be developed there, proto-cinema and then later on cinema and virtual reality, how from the get-go they are bound up with religious and mythological and imaginative productions in a very interesting way. And then in the third section, I picked a few examples of some contemporary developments that I think resonate with this story. And then I'll talk a little bit about my book, which fits in loosely with the topic. So the first section, Media Imaginalis. So if we go back and talk a little bit about the philosophical problem of the imagination. We're going to start in the Western tradition, of course, with Plato and the famous allegory of the cave, which everybody knows. But the allegory of the cave is also a kind of meditation on the imagination, both in terms of art and aesthetics and poetry and music, but also the literal sense of an image as a vehicle for some kind of thought or idea. So if you remember the classic situation, you and me and everybody you've known are all chained in this cave, and we're looking at a wall, and on the wall we're seeing the shadows of objects that are behind us. So all we see are the shadows moving, but behind us there are the actual objects, and behind that is, let's say, the sun, the light source. But we can't turn around. We can't see the objects, and we can't see the sun. So this is Plato's meditation on metaphysics and the imagination. So all we see are these images, and they are mere reflections, poor imitations of the true forms, the ideas with a capital I, that we can't directly access with our fallen senses. And so we're stuck in this kind of problem. He thought that reason and the philosophical path would enable us to actually get out of the cave, not only see the forms, but bathe in the light of the sun. But he did not believe that all of the works of the imagination, the images, art, aesthetics, music, poetry, was going to help at all. For him, all of that stuff was an imitation of an imitation of an imitation, a pale reflection of the truth. So in the Republic, where he establishes his ideal kingdom, banishes all that. None of that stuff's allowed because it gets in the way of the signal, the rational signal that is greater and more true than the image reflection. Now, so this image we have here is from the Renaissance period when these ideas were still going on, because there's this question, a more, let's say, scientific question also, is like, what is the imagination? I mean, when I sit there and I think of, I remember something I did when I was a kid, or I think about my dream last night, or when I have dreams at all, like what's actually happening. So if Plato gave us a particular metaphysics of the imagination, his rival and pal Aristotle gives us a more technical understanding. That's really important, because part of what I'm saying here is that the problem of the imagination is also a technical problem. So what is the imagination? According to Aristotle. So he believed that there was a kind, and there's a core problem here in what he's trying to answer, which is like, how do you relate mind and matter? How do we relate the world of ideas and thought and reason and understanding with the physical world that we're obviously in? What connects those? It's a problem of mediation. So for Aristotle, imagination is the mediator between these two things. And how does it work? Well, in terms of the physical world, the sensory world, everything's radiating rays of light. Those lights, this is their model, go into my eyes, and they inscribe a representation on my pneuma, my soul, this sort of fine material, responsive essence that he needs to posit in order to explain how this kind of process would work. So once that image is inscribed in my mind, it's kind of detached from the sensory object, and it stays with me. It stays in my memory. If I want to project and tell a story about it, I can kind of call it up. But sometimes they kind of get a little bit out of control, and I'll talk about that in terms of a problem that we recognize today in our lives. We've all been absurdly in love. And when you're absurdly in love, your imagination is taken over by the image of the other. And that doesn't just mean that you think about them all the time, but a lot of people see them when they're not there. Oh, there's somebody there, that's them. No, it's not them. Oh, that hair, it's her hair. Oh my God. You're in this zone. And this happened to the ancients too. And they said, well, what's happening there? Well, what's happening there is that the image, the phantasm, because that's sort of one of the words that they talked about in the literature for these images that are internalized, the phantasm has kind of gotten out of control. And it's beginning to vampirize the system. So images have a certain agency in this model. So if Plato is talking on a kind of level of metaphysics about the imagination as a kind of poor reflection of the world of truth, Aristotle, in a way, is the first person who internalizes the imagination, who says this is something that's going on inside the mind. He's a psychologist in this sense. And what's going on is that these representations are kind of moving around and to some extent have a life of their own. So here's a good picture where you can kind of see this sense of mediation. The sensible world is on the lower left. That's all working with the senses. Then you have this imaginative world, which has these different spheres in it. And finally, the world of intellectual ideas or forms in Plato's idea. But this idea of the imagination as a mediator between the sensory world and this world of the ideal also has a religious dimension. Because, well, that's God, if you're a religious person. So in some traditions, and here where I'm going to be talking about the Islamic mysticism, because that leads us to Henri Corbin, who's an important figure in the history of the ideas that constitute this place. So there's a problem there. So you have a prophetic religion. What does that mean? That means there are prophets, and the prophets see visions, and those visions are true. They're from God. Well, how does that work? Well, how do we say that? So what Corbin talked about in finding it in Ibn Arabi, and it's actually throughout the Islamic tradition, is the idea that, again, the imagination is a mediator. It mediates between God, in a way like it's a Neoplatonic idea essentially, but it's now filled with the idea of God and the sensory world. And that mediation is its own place, this mundus imaginalis. It's a zone of theophonic experience where one is encountering an image absolutely redolent with the beyond, with the highest good in the cosmos, and yet is still recognizable in our sensory language because it's being mediated by the imagination. So here's a quote from Corbin. Unlike common knowledge, which is affected by a penetration of the sense impressions of the outside world into the interior of the soul, that's basically what Aristotle's talking about, the work of prophetic inspiration is a projection of the inner soul upon the outside world. The active imagination guides, anticipates, molds sense perception. That is why it transmutes sensory data into symbols. The burning bush is only a brushwood fire if it is merely perceived by the sensory organs. In order that Moses may perceive the burning bush and hear the voice calling him from the right side of the valley, an organ of transsensory perception is needed. And this was Corbin's really cool, weird idea, is that the imagination, the full imagination, the active imagination, is an organ of perception. It's not just a feature of the mind in some kind of general sense. It is an organ of perception the way our eyes are organs of perception, and our tongues are organs of perception. And it's an organ that is in the world that it perceives. So once you're on the theophonic level, it's like your eye has opened and you're seeing this whole other kind of domain laid on top, projected, and he uses that word, projected onto the sensory world, so that the ordinary brushwood fire, with that eye opened, becomes a burning bush, becomes a theophany, an expression and manifestation of God. So this is, all good stuff. One thing I want you to note right away is just the language of projection. One of the things that's been going on in all these descriptions is mediation A somehow mediates to B, transforming itself as it moves, and also that this process involves projection. And we'll get to more projection in a sec. But there's a problem with this whole kind of idea of the imagination, the prophetic imagination. So again, it's in a situation where there are prophets of revealed religions who have true visions that then found the religion. What do you do with false prophets? What are they seeing? Are they seeing, is their eye opened, or it's not really open? They're making it up? So there's a fundamental ambivalence in these creative ideas of the active imagination in the sense of, are these true visions or not? And so if you read Corbin carefully, he's going to say, yes, well, these visions are true, they're authorized by God, just the way Plato would say, yeah, maybe some images are true because they're so clearly representative of the higher ideas, but usually they stray. Usually oftentimes they're false. So there's a falseness, a potential for falseness that's embedded in the category of the imagination, and that various people try to deal with in different ways by putting it over here. Oh, that's a false prophet. Oh, you can tell it's not supported by Scripture, or you come up with some reason to explain why that's not a true vision, while these other visions are true. And this is going to follow all the way through the history of the imagination. So one thing that's important about Corbin's idea of the organ of the imagination is it's giving the imagination a profoundly productive power. I mean, this is at the core of the idea of psyche in this domain that Pacifica is all about, is that the psyche is a productive, creative, active agency. It's not just a mediator, it's not just a reflector, it's not just a secondary feature of things. And this idea of the imagination as being a central, creative, productive power really defines the modern idea of the imagination. It's already in Ibn Arabi, as we're talking about, but that's still under a kind of theological framework. It's in the modern world with philosophers like Immanuel Kant and the Romantic movement that we really see the idea of imagination as its own kind of autonomous power. So for Kant, the imagination is what allows all the various categories we have that organize experience to be synthesized into this one world that we're experiencing. So this one world that we're experiencing, which is still a problem in neuroscience, the binding problem. How do all our various sensory inputs come together into a single sensory, fluid, integrated world? For Kant, that was the imagination. So we're like in the imagination all the time. It's extremely productive. It's extremely central. And Romanticism, of course, made it essentially a religion of imagination. But even here, the same problem comes back. So if you read Coleridge, who was sort of the most intellectual representative of the Romantic movement in the English-speaking world, who read Kant and other German idealists and sort of translated their ideas into a whole aesthetic, if you read him, he says, okay, there's the imagination, the creative imagination, the imagination that philosophers and poets are interested in, and then there is what he called fancy, a lower imagination, an imagination that was more the way Plato saw it, which was just a feature of the mind that could put different pieces together and kind of stick them together. You know, sort of like our lame dreams. You wake up in the morning, oh, I remember my dream. That's totally boring. Why? Because it's just, you know where all the parts come from the day before, and they're smashed together in an inelegant fashion, and you're like, there's not a lot of message there for me. That's not very interesting. Barely worth writing down. But that idea of the imagination, that it's something that just kind of takes bits and pieces, fuses it together, is merely reflective, is always shadowed with this idea of the active imagination, the creative imagination, the theophonic imagination. And so what I'm saying is that our modern condition is the inability to tell the difference between those two in a lot of cases, most of the time, probably. So people over here are like making a religion out of some crazy, diluted idea that we can all recognize, but you're like, well, where am I going to say they didn't have a true vision? I don't know. You know, our UFO contactees, they seem kind of crazy a lot of the time, but who's to say they're not having a true vision? I don't own true vision. And that ambiguity is really constitutive of the kind of modern post-religion situation. And it's only aided and abetted by imaginal machines. But before I get to the technology section, I want to sort of, if we've been talking about God and theophany and theology and things like that, I want to answer or to suggest something for you, archetypal thinkers, is if we have to pick an archetype for technology, and I guess I'm thinking particularly about media technology, though I think it's beyond that one, what is it? What's the archetype? Is it a maker? Is it whatever? For me, it's very clear. And it has to do with this problem that I've already identified with the way that there's a fundamental ambiguity, questioning, trickiness, potential for deception inside technology itself, as well as the idea of imaginations. Of course, we're in the realm of the trickster. And the realm of the trickster, the trickster is an interesting archetype because it's not clear to me like how far back it'll go. I mean, there's something about technology always in the trickster. Like if you see here, Coyote makes the world. Hermes, here he's fashioning the caduceus in the 19th century image, but he makes the lyre. He uses techne in order to disguise and deceive. That's Loki with his net. And Eshu Legbara, there are many, like Hermes, is a communicator. He moves between the high world and the world of men and women, but the message gets distorted a lot of the time. In fact, he plays games with it, like maybe he says something is true, say something is not true. So there's a whole cluster around the ambiguity of information once it's passed through a media. And that's the situation that we're all in. We're all in the situation where, like, if I'm at the source of the signal, then I can understand it, but we're not at the source of the signal. You're telling me the story for a thing that happened yesterday. I'm reading the newspaper of something that happened over there. I'm getting messages in dreams, but who's sending them? And am I interpreting the dream correctly? We're always in the situation of mediation where there are these problems. Is there noise on the line? Are they telling the truth? Am I getting a mixed signal? And that's the world we're in. So we're wrestling with that trickster space. And technology, machinery, doesn't particularly help, if that's a problem. So here we are going to imaginal machines. This is an image from Athanasius Kircher's book on light, which came out towards the end of the 17th century. So we're at that magic into science, myth into reason phase of early modernity. And characters like Kircher were both. He was both a magician and a scientist in our modern sense of the term. And this is about light. And so you can kind of see in this picture how alchemical it looks. You have the caduceus, you have reflection, you have the sun and moon, all of that's going on. And at the same time, it's kind of an essay on the physics of light and how the physics of light support and propagate this world, the world of the image or the imagination. And so what we start seeing at this time period are the emergence of new technologies of vision. This is a camera obscura. These aren't super clear images. If you've ever been in a camera obscura, it's basically just it's a light camera. It's a box with a hole in it, and the image from the outside world is inverted but perfectly reproduced on the inside. They're very ghostly. They're very uncanny. There's something spectral about them. And all of those features were recognized immediately. And that's part of what my story is here, is that particularly with these technologies that you're about to see, is that there's an aspect of them that is spectral and uncanny. So even if they are made with reason, and even if they are using new technologies, and even if they're displayed as examples of our new rational scientific powers, our ability to manipulate the physics of light and produce effects, that they are haunted by this imaginal world that in some sense is being superseded. And particularly haunted by the ghosty spectral side of it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So here, one of these images is from Roger Bacon. I think the other one is from Kircher. What interested me about this is, you can see the figure on the top. You see how it's sort of inverted on the inside of the building, which is the camera. But the images chosen are not from the real world. They're either statues or whatever they are, figures. And so even here in trying to represent a technology that only reproduces the sensory world, nothing is added, even here a spectral or imaginal or mythic dimension enters in. Things get much weirder with the magic lantern, which again goes back to, I think this is also a Kircher image. So you know with a magic lantern, you basically have a light, you have a camera, you have a slide, just a little glass slide with an image on it, and it gets projected onto the wall. So notice already also that we're still in even though this is science, we're also in a metaphysical theater. We're also in Plato's cave. We're still wrestling with this fundamental problem about the nature of the image. And then, in addition, when you go back and look at these images from the 17th and 18th centuries about the magic lantern, once again, many times the images that you see are images of death or revelation or souls in hell or, in this case, a big scary demon. So there's this sense that once we open up this other imaginal world, in a sense creating a technological analog of that imaginative faculty that Corbin talked about. I mean, Corbin was talking about something that's profoundly deeply in the soul. And what modernity does is say, we can make that. We can create the mundus imaginalis through techne by understanding the physics of light and building cool machines. But once we do that, what does it get inhabited with? It gets inhabited with our sneaking suspicion that our reason and rationality are not the whole picture, because we're still haunted. We're haunted by our own deaths. We're haunted by the fear of hell. We're haunted by our own dreams. We're haunted by the sense that maybe there's something larger than we're seeing in this, what will become the kind of cage of modernity. Here's another example. Now, by the time you get to the 19th century, there's magic lantern slides for everything. So there's sensory world, travel, pictures, exotica, everything's there. So it's not like everyone's completely obsessed with these kinds of images, but they persist, almost as if the technology is meditating on its own ability to interrupt an ordinary life and introduce the viewer to a world of phantasms. Another feature of magic lanterns, particularly in the 19th century, this is called a chromatope, and there are these moving, because you can move the glass slides, and so you create this sort of moving kaleidoscopic effect. Now, for us today, with virtual reality and CGI, et cetera, this is pretty tame stuff. But if you imagine just the way that medieval peasants who lived in a brown and gray world would walk into a cathedral and be absolutely blown away on a sunny day by the stained glass, so too would audiences in the 18th and 19th century be amazed like fireworks. And it's a really important aspect of these technologies, because while I'm mostly talking about the image, the phantasm, or what we could also call the simulacrum once we start to technologize it, but the phantasm will do. There's another side of these technologies which they're also used to overload the senses and to create a kind of analog of a mystical or frenzied or Dionysian state. And that's also an important feature of these things, to play with our own nervous systems in a way that produces intense experiences that have an analog to more classic mystical experiences. But the real sort of proof in the pudding on the magic lantern is the growth of the phantasmagoria in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These first started in France, and basically what they did, they were sort of like haunted houses where they would use magic lanterns, costumes. They would do them in crypts or in abandoned buildings, smoke, and they would combine all of these elements together in order to stage a sort of phantasmagoria, an encounter with ghosts and spirits. They would, create moving images by putting magic lantern slides on carts and moving them up and back so things would get bigger. They would overlap them so you'd see a ghost and its eyes would move. And what's important about the situation is that it helps us see very clearly a fundamental dynamic of modernity. So if I am right that what these imaginal machines and what other later imaginal machines like cinema and virtual reality are doing is that they're creating, using techne, a contained space within which the traces, the longings, the reverberations, the resonances of the much larger history of the imagination are allowed to exist. Then we as moderns have to engage those specters, those phantasms, in a profoundly contradictory way. And this is part of the essence of the imaginal machine in the modern world. So, for example, here we are. We're in a phantasmagoria. We go in here, maybe we're a little drunk. Today we get a little stoned. You go in there, all these experiences happen. You're creeped out. You're not really sure what's going on. Maybe you even see an image of someone you know, because he would do that. He would take images of people who had died and then project them. And if those of you who know your religious history will see that we're looking towards spiritualism here, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So it's not just entertainment. It's also this profound attraction to the question of the afterlife, the question of ghosts, to the great death and resurrection show that in some sense is the heart of all entertainment on an archetypal level. And at the same time, we're getting the message that this is all just illusion, all just tricks, all just technology. So here's Robertson, who's the guy who started the whole thing. It is a useful spectacle for a man to discover the bizarre effects of the imagination when it combines force and disorder. I wish to speak of the terror which shadows, symbols, spells, the occult world of magic inspire. I have promised to raise the dead, and I will raise them. In fact, he would even have a whole shtick about, I tried to raise the dead, and I figured out how to do it, and da-da-da. And that was part of the fiction you would read as you went in. But at the same time, in all his public pronouncements, he insisted that his images were, quote, illusions designed as an antidote to credulity and supernaturalism. And that this was a rational exhibition designed to expose the mechanism behind the specters. That's so weird. I mean, when you think about it, when you look at it from a distance, like, you want this amazing, deep experience of encounter with the whole question of life and death and specters and memory and ghosts and it's totally bullshit. Or it's just a game. It's just a trick. It's empty. It's profane. Don't worry about it. Just an entertainment. And that polarity, that dynamic is the modern relationship with the imaginal. It's both of those things constantly redeployed and renegotiated over and over again. We see the same dynamic in stage magic. Stage magic is full of the same thing. The stage magician is the ultimate death and resurrection show. Saws a woman in half. Oh my God, then she comes back. It goes back to the to the shamans of old. In fact, there's a wonderful book. If you're into this kind of stuff, this book's worth hunting. It's expensive, it's rare, but you might be able to find it. Rogan Taylor, The Death and Resurrection Show. And he makes an exceptionally well-argued case that you can trace a line of continuity from the death and resurrection shows of the shaman, who goes into the other world, climbs up the tree, goes down into the underworld, comes back with the retrieved soul or whatever, and is doing it not just internally, but as a performance in front of the crowd with a costume and jingle jangles and drums and all that kind of stuff. And you can trace a line from that to clowns, to commedia dell'arte, to modern entertainment very clearly. And it's a really, really convincing case. And so when I look at all this stuff, I see a distant reflection of a more primordial, indigenous, and earnest encounter, though still with its tricks, because shamans, of course, are also tricksters. Oh, this go a little bit of chicken fat out of the side of your body. Oh no, it's I pulled it out of your body, really. So there's a trickster element even in shamanic healing that in today's sort of romanticized ideas of shamanism we don't hear as much about, but was certainly part of the way that Western people perceive shamans at different periods of time. So we're in this kind of question of the secular and the sacred, but it doesn't mean that the sacred doesn't get technologized too. This is called the celestial telegraph, which already kind of clues you in that the development of spiritualism, which was an incredibly widespread, very popular religious phenomena that wasn't just among uneducated classes, but among the elite all across the developed world, an enormous religious event in the late 19th century, was deeply bound up with ideas of magnetism, electricity, and even the telegraph, which kind of started at roughly the same time in the middle of the century. One of the most obvious kind of relics of the supernatural fantasies or visions of the spiritualism are these spiritualist photographs, which were very popular at the time. Now, these are great because it's really ambiguous what they are, in the sense that we look at that and we go, come on, you don't really believe that, right? I mean, it's cool, but like, you don't really believe that. And it's hard to know. It's hard to know how people reacted to these images, because photography itself was a new art. It was already a magical thing that you could put a piece of paper in a box and open a thing, and then later on you got a picture and it's your friend. And in fact, a lot of photography in the late 19th century, particularly in America and England, was devoted to photographing the dead. You know, you might not have a picture of yourself, but if your child died, you'd get a photograph of the child. So there's a relationship between photography, which captures an image or a trace of an image. Again, it's that problem of the mediation, captures a trace, and yet it seems to kind of resist death, and so then it becomes kind of ghostly already. You know, you look at photographs of loved ones who've died, and there's an extra charge there. Well, spiritualism just like ran with that energy, and so they started to like, you know, do these double exposures, and how they function in people's lives is kind of hard to say, where they are treated. Some people saw it as entertainment. Some people would go to spiritualist shows just for fun. You know, the medium's cute and, you know, weird stuff happens and it's better than sitting around reading. And other people were profoundly believing and really, really wanting to connect with their loved ones. Just to show you how weird it would get, some people who were critics of this stuff or skeptics would say, you know, that image, the superimposed image, is on another photograph. Here's the other photograph. You know, they'd find the other photograph where the ghost image came from, and then the spiritualists would say, yeah, but the spirits are doing that. So once you open up that possibility, we get into this really loopy sense that tells us something about the imagination, which is that it begins to reproduce itself and kind of get out of control. We're not really sure where we are anymore. We have to rein it in. You know, if you're Plato, you're like, rein it all the way in, like, just go back over here. And if you're a theological person, you say, well, there's some principle of true vision, true theophonic imagination, so these ones are okay and everything else is demonic. Or you're more of a modern person like me and go, it's all simulacra. We're in a trickster dance of multiplying simulacra and phantasms flying in from left and right, and we can't track them anymore. I mean, how many of you have had dreams, supposedly the most intimate, autopoetic aspect of our own imaginations, and yet in those dreams you've had, you know, advertisements, images from corporations, you know, campaigns, cartoon figures from, you know, Disney, whatever. Our imaginations are also colonized by things that are clearly profane in origin, and that's sort of the world that I think that we're trying to manipulate. So back to our story of imaginal machines. We're almost done with this. Then, of course, this is all leading towards the emergence of cinema. So this is 1906, Georges Méliès. So just notice all the kind of archetypal or mythical figures. We have the magic book, the book, of course, being another information technology of an older era. He's clearly an alchemist with an anathema. A dream. Yeah, it's... Whoa, how did that happen? Okay, what do we have here? We have a trickster figure. We have a devil, a something a little uncanny. Very much like the Phantasmagoria kinds of images. But not just horror images. We know we have images of some sort of celestial woman. Elemental language, water, fire. The magical essence. More special effects. And a resurrected ghost. Did I just watch a movie? The evil trickster triumphs. So Malleus was a magician, and one of the things I like about that image is the way that the Athenor, this vessel of transformation, is also a screen. It's also a screen, literally in terms of we're seeing it as something that's getting projected onto, but it functions as a source of images or phantasms. And this question of projection, I don't have time to go into it. Maybe we can do it in question and answer. Is really key. So if you look at like Jung's writings on alchemy. He's like, what's going on here? It's not all just in the imagination. There's alchemists actually doing stuff in the lab, and they're making weird states of matter occur. And he says, well, what's happening is that the imagination or the psyche projects itself onto this nebulous matter. And so you make novel events happen in the world, you're going to get a greater intimacy with the more rare functions of the psyche, which project themselves on to this object. So we're in this very interesting world of both being projected on and projecting all the time. And we use that language all the time in terms of, oh, you're projecting that on me. Where is it? Where is it in my eyes? Are you doing it to me? And then at the same time, we're also interpolated in all these ways. But the other point to make about this is we were all laughing. They were laughing in the 1906 as well. And so this raises a really interesting question that I suspect many of you who do sort of depth psychology or Jungian interpretations of popular culture wrestle with. So here's the problem. On the one hand, you can look at this and see the traces of authentic, no joke, mystical, imaginal work, stuff that goes all the way back to indigenous vision quests, that includes esoteric mystics, includes Renaissance magicians, people who are really going for it with the psyche. We can see traces of that in this, and then later on in Disney. And remember, never forget Disney's famous name for its artists as Imagineers. Imagineers, that crossing of engineering and imagination. So on the one hand, we can find these traces and celebrate them. Oh, we still see, here's the hero's journey in Star Wars, and here's this and that, and da-da-da-da. Great. It's true. It's going on. It's partly why it's successful. People resonate with it. And at the same time, these are tricks. They are made with technology, and they're often made by corporations and bodies that are perfectly willing to do whatever they want to do in order to make money, in order to maybe even manipulate people a little bit. Because if you get them thinking this way, then they're not going to be paying attention to this stuff over there. So we can't get outside of the problem, the ambiguity of the phantasm, even if we recognize these archetypal patterns inside popular culture. We're in a more difficult situation, a more tricksterish situation, where we can't exactly trust the origins, essence, and function of the very archetypal traces that we discover. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip these next two more modern slides. That's virtual reality, talking about the 90s, and then go to the last part of the talk. Hyperstations is a kind of lame jargon term, but whatever, that's the one I used, for the problem that what do we do with fictions that become real? How do we talk about fictions that become real? This could be Sherlock Holmes. He starts writing novels, whatever, and then people start kind of treating Sherlock Holmes as if he was real, then they go to his house, and then a whole fandom emerges, and so something hyperstational has happened there. In some sense, if we want to be skeptics, all religions are hyperstations. At some point, people were telling stories, and then somehow they got rolling, and now we have the Catholic Church and all of the myriad experiences that people have within the context of the Catholic Church. So in some sense, it's a really broad category, but I think it's specifically important to look at the problem. What happens when people begin to interact with concocted, invented works of the imagination, treat them as real, and then something starts to happen? Things gain a life of their own. And I talk about this a lot in my new book, High Weirdness. It's mostly about these three psychonauts, Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson. But I put their experiences in the 70s in the context of an investigation of the 70s and what happened there in terms of the imagination, in terms of visionary experience, in terms of new religious movements, in terms of the occult revival. There's a lot of stuff that happens there, and we're all still kind of in a way in a shadow of those things. But the one thing that I wanted to talk about, one of the things that I see happening in the 1970s is a rise of these kinds of hyperstitions. So here's an example. From the 1940s, you have the emergence of modern witchcraft, and then increasingly broad neo-pagan movements. So these are pretty small communities who are just rediscovering a kind of more indigenous style of religion within a European context. And they're practicing authentically. A lot of them believe that they're actually recovering existing traditions that have been passed down in secret. So it's not that they're inventing things. They are tapping into actual traditions. Their teacher got it from another teacher, and that person was someone who was part of some underground group that kept these things alive throughout modernity. This is the way a lot of people thought. Then the end of the 60s, early 1970s, some people who were kind of neo-pagans went, we can just make stuff up. Let's just invent a ritual. And so people started just inventing rituals, and stuff happened. It kind of worked. It was like, whoa, let's do that again. Who was that? I don't know. Let's keep rolling down. The most extreme example were Satanists and left-hand path magicians who began to work with the entities in H.P. Lovecraft's horror fiction. And, according to them, they got results. So we're in this weird place where fictions, pure imagination, begins to have a foothold on reality. And in some sense, that's kind of always what we've been doing. We've been doing that with stories and ideologies and myths and gods. But that process of intentionally kind of realizing images or fictions is radically intensified in our current technological environment. And that's partly why you see things like the growth of conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory has always been there in America. We were worried about the Illuminati in 1805. But the intensity and presence of conspiracy theories has a lot to do with the way contemporary media environments support, feed, and allow the creation of a sort of sense of reality to fictions by connecting to other websites like, oh, wow, they're all saying this, it's got to be true, or creating video. And, we're just on the lip of a radical transformation in our relationship to realistic video, because those things are going to be able to be concocted in very, very convincing ways already, but very soon that will begin to impact our sense of the news, our sense of what's actually going on. That is going to be hairball, folks. That is not going to be fun. I mean, we're already in this post-truth thing, and that, that's going to be ratcheting it up. And that's, again, we're in that trickster labyrinth. Like, there is light, there are forces on our side, there's good stuff going on, but it's a really confusing kind of situation. So I wanted to end with 3 kind of quick examples of the ways in which the imaginal machines are kind of mutating today. One is augmented reality. So here's Pokemon Go. Looks really fun. I think if I was 8 years old, I would have really liked Pokemon Go. But you can look at it also in terms of this world that we were talking about, is like the imagination as a medium between the mind and sensory reality. Well, now it's like you're actually incarnating that layer. And so the technology itself is serving as the mediating function, where it's becoming the kind of home of these objects that are both in the world, in the sensory world, and in the kind of playful world. So that was a big rage. Everybody heard about that. This is a new game from the same people that came out this summer. I don't know how popular it is, how good it is, but it's a Harry Potter version. And I particularly, picked that because, one, the thing about this world, this sort of technological mediation space that we've created, is that magic is a very good analogy for how it works. And if you go back in the history of video games, and you go back in the history of hacking and computer programming, magical metaphors are at the heart of it, because you're in a world of code. You're in a world where language makes what's going on. So there's a natural affinity of magic with these virtual worlds. So it's not just that the surface play is magical, it's that the technology, in some sense, is magical. And I really like that portal on the right there, giving a little sense of the wormhole quality of new media. So that's one dimension. You can imagine all sorts of fun things here. Anybody know what this is about? Anybody catch? Oh, so what's going on over there to the left? It's a little creepy. What? Yeah. So here we got Slendy. So Slender Man, very, really important thing to think about in terms of myth and the imagination in the modern condition. So unlike a lot of sort of internet memes or myths, Slender Man does have a named author. A lot of times they're just anonymous. But it grew up in this very collective world called Something Awful, where they were attempting to make memes, and some of them wanted to make memes that were spooky or horror-related or magical. And some of them were quite potent and very peculiar and powerful. But it was very much about this sort of new, anonymous, peer-to-peer swarm kind of creation that's a very important part of internet culture today. That some folklorists think is actually bringing us back to something that's more like folklore in a pre-modern context, because there aren't authors, it's collectively done, it mutates all over the place, stories get retold in all sorts of different conditions. But of course, Slender Man had a sort of pride of place because these, everybody knows the story, 12-year-old girls in Wisconsin take it seriously, and they seem to have had mental issues, but in a way that doesn't quite matter in the sense of our ability to recognize that once you get something like Slender Man going and it resonates, there's something creepy about it, you're like, ooh, that's a little spooky, it gets in there, it's going to little phantasms, it's kind of moving around, then that's going to make it more available to people who are mentally ill or people who need some kind of fantastic structure to their lives, and feeling like they were going to get some goodies from Slender Man. They stabbed this girl. They didn't kill her, luckily. But it really points to the viral nature of these hyperstitions, and that many people are consciously trying to make them work as well as possible. They're not all dark like this, but a lot of them are. And though I didn't want to go into it on this talk, this is not unrelated to some of the meme magic that was associated with the election of Donald Trump, where some alt-right people were turning a goofy cartoon frog, very funny, oh ha ha ha, it must be ironic, into a vector of a kind of viral, creepy set of concepts and ideas that also drew from the imagination. If you don't know that story, you can ask me about it, or I'll talk about it later. It's actually kind of a long, not very happy tale. And then the last is AI. AI. So this is Sophia. We probably all kind of heard about Sophia because she was a big hit in the news cycle, about a year or so ago when she was made a citizen of Saudi Arabia. This Sophia was made by the Hansen Labs, which also made a Philip K. Dick android whose head was famously lost, which might have been part of the canny marketing campaign, because these guys are really canny marketers. And that's going to be my point. My point is that whatever AI is, and we can talk about what it is, what's likely, what's not likely, different philosophies of AI, on some level it doesn't matter, because we are now in a culture where the idea of AI and the science fiction images of robots, of HAL from 2001 we saw, and all of these other fictions, images, and some that resonate with very old archetypes or very old ideas about non-human powers and non-human knowledge, that all of that stuff is now occupying the space between us as ordinary people trying to figure out what's going on and the people who want to tell us that their thing is an AI. So the point is, whether or not they're AI, and an AI person says, okay, that's real AI, we're already being told they are. We're already in a world where AIs are already making decisions. And you see this in advertising. There was a big bank campaign a couple years ago where it's like, no, you don't talk to a person anymore. You talk to the blue cube who's going to help you do your investments properly. And we're like, okay, I'll talk to the blue cube. Cool. And so when we see this, we're like, wow, AI, Sophia, the android. But when roboticists looked at her, they're like, it's a chat bot with a face. It's totally bullshit technology. It's not impressive. It's not learning. It's not doing anything that a real AI would do. So it's like we're stuck in a myth that we have to kind of disenchant even as we move towards the world where AIs are really making decisions and really having agency. And that's already true. But it's like we can't get rid of the imagination. We don't really know what to do with it. We need it to understand the future, and yet all the forms that it takes are going to be manipulated by the people who want to manipulate our ideas about agency and who gets AI and what's a good AI and what's a bad AI. So, it's like we have to be imaginal. It's like people who are tuned into the imaginal, we need to be tuned in real bright and sharpen our critical acumen. It's not a time to go, wow, the new technology is, tapping into these great archetypal patterns, and we're in a darker situation than that. But the imagination is still absolutely at the center of it, because it's partly about how we develop models to understand something that is unthinkable. And so that's sort of the new way, I would like to say, is that, kind of end with this, and then I'll show one other clip, is that if I've been talking so far about how the imagination is a mediator between the sensory world and, let's say, the world of ideas, or the world of God, or the world of archetypes, because remember, in classic theory, the archetype is not the expression that we see in mythology and imagery and iconography. It's a more primal, ungraspable, difficult to represent pattern, but something that's hard to represent. Gets manifested in a particular context, and then that's what we're looking at. The imagination is also the way in which we look towards a future that is extremely difficult to imagine. So that future that we're looking towards, some people think you can algorithmically get a sense of what's going on, what's the most likely outcome. Let's do all the statistics, all the tables. Let's do scenario casting. Oh, scenarios, what do they use? Well, they use the imagination. Oh, actually, we're very deeply in the imagination because it's, in some ways, almost all we have, along with some, a lot of rational tools that are very helpful. But it's one of the only tools we have to even envision what a world with AIs is like, what a world of constant climate catastrophe is like, what a world of animated entities that are making decisions we have to negotiate all the time. Are you good? Are you bad? It's like we're in the magical world of the Renaissance magician who does all this elaborate labor with their technology to call up a spirit, and it's an angel. We got an angel. Are you really an angel? Actually, we are really. And if you read accounts from Renaissance magicians when they call up angels, a lot of what they do is testing them. because they're not sure if they're angels. They could be devils in disguise. And we're in that relationship with these things. But with one final, I'm not going to talk about this. I just think it's a cute video. Again, I'm not sure how far this one got around. But it just shows how our ideas of artificial intelligence and androids do have an explicit religious or kind of mystical dimension. Oops, let me go back.
という思いが湧き上がってくる。家族をはじめとする身近な人たち、さらには目覚めたなら今度は自分以外の人たちのために生きたいという思いが湧き上がってくる。
で、決定的な違いは、私も仲間も僧侶も同じような法話をし、同じような言葉を交わすんですが、死にます。死んだら途絶えます。ロボットは死なない。だからロボットは永久に進化し続けてくれるんですね。だからここに魅力があるんです、ロボットの。
慈しみが自分を救うことにもつながってくる。
All right, there we go. She chants the Heart Sutra too, which I think is particularly interesting. The form is emptiness, emptiness is form, robots are gods, gods are robots. All right, well, I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for your attention.